Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and today is episode 2 of the Cathar Crusade. Kill them all. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, the Christian church in Western Europe had transformed from a loosely connected movement of charismatic preachers into a hierarchical organization, with the papacy in Rome placing itself at the top of that hierarchy. The groups of heretics that sprung up across Europe around the same time resembled each other, not because they were connected, but because they were reacting to the same changes introduced by a distant centralized church that interfered with their local customs. Most of the heretics were either co-opted into the church or crushed. The surviving heretics drifted south to the Languedoc region of southern France, bordering Spain, attracted by the tolerant atmosphere. Calling themselves the Cathars, these heretics became accepted members of the local society because they worked hard and gained converts through persuasion rather than repression. They did so in safety because the Count of Toulouse and the other leading nobles of the region had little desire to persecute popular preachers, until Count Raymond V of Toulouse used the excuse of heresy to obtain support from the English and French kings against the independent-minded city of Toulouse and the expansionist kingdom of Aragon. When Raymond VI succeeded his father to become Count of Toulouse in 1194, he preferred to enjoy his life rather than devote his energy to the unpleasant task of uprooting a heresy that did not threaten his rule. Actually, the established church was more of a threat, since he struggled with numerous abbots and bishops as he either seized their castles or built castles on their lands. Moreover, the Count's official vassals were independent-minded and combative. Marriage alliances barely prevented outright war. The Count's survival was largely due to the fact that neither he nor the other main families, notably Foix and Trencavel, could call up large armies or afford to hire them. Instead, there was constant raiding, as lords would descend from their mountain castles to raid or besiege a rival's castle and then retreat home whenever the situation proved unfavorable. The Counts of Toulouse had struggled against the Angevin kings for decades, until the marriage of Richard's sister Joan to Count Raymond had ended that rivalry. But Raymond had little peace, since he had a closer rival, the Trencavels, who held the nearby Viscounty of Beziers. Headquartered in the mighty fortress of Carcasonne, the Trencavel lands nearly cut the Languedoc in half. Bordering Aragon, they made themselves vassals of that kingdom to strengthen their independence from Toulouse. Recognizing that he could not defeat them, Raymond VI married a Trencavel, Beatrice of Beziers, which might have produced a new dynasty able to face its numerous expansionist rivals. Unfortunately, the marriage did not work out, and she also became a perfect. Despite his annoyance at the new count's lack of religious fervor, 88-year-old Pope Celestine III had more immediate concerns, since the gigantic ransom paid by King Richard of England to ensure his release from captivity in February 1194 enabled Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI to expand into Italy as he claimed the throne of Sicily. If Raymond had continued to deal with elderly popes preoccupied with other matters, his reign would have remained pleasant. However, he found himself faced with 37-year-old Pope Innocent III in 1198, and Innocent was determined to impose his will rather than merely guide worshippers. Innocent did not regard Catharism as a minor local oddity, but a symptom of a cancer spreading throughout Christendom. When Innocent became Pope, he decided to follow the example of Pope Gregory VII, who had placed the Pope, namely himself, above all of the crowned heads in Christendom. Actually, the desire to reign above even an emperor was understandable. Innocent was born in 1161, when Pope Alexander III had to seek refuge in France because Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa had claimed Italy and viewed the Pope as his personal clergyman, not the head of an independent church. Growing up during the 17 years of schism, as Barbarossa backed a series of rival popes, he naturally developed a powerful desire to secure the independence of the papacy. Innocent's rise, despite his relatively young age, was helped by the fact that Pope Clement III was his uncle. Cultural conflict was a key factor. The northern lords had expanded their dominance of their regions by hiring mercenaries, rather than raising men through the time-consuming process of persuading their followers to risk their lives to expand their lord's territory. Mercenaries required steady revenue, so the lords needed clerks to manage their lands, and those clerks were recruited from the schools of Paris and Bologna. Attracting bright young men from all over Europe, the schools provided them with similar intellectual training, outlook, and values, and these clerks would then manage the courts of kings, dukes, and counts, and staff the papacy and the various archbishoprics. Innocent had been educated in those schools. The cultural environment in the Languedoc must have appeared alien to the graduates of Paris. The Cathars preached, "Love thy neighbor," while the troubadours preached, "Love thy neighbor's wife." Or rather, love who you want, not who you are assigned in a commercial negotiation of land. Thriving in the tolerant atmosphere of the Languedoc, there were roughly 1,000 to 1,500 perfects in the Languedoc in 1200, including the Count of Foix's sister Escalmonde. In the Languedoc, the petty lords and their families lived in fortified villages in a constant state of seasonal warfare. Since property rights were transferred through marriage dowries, and those subdivided ownerships concealed a nest of grievances and ambitions, society had developed an emphasis on good manners and tolerance. So they naturally preferred the Cathar approach over the intrusive, ritualized, and expensive demands of the Northern Church. Always short of money, the nobles feuded with the bishops and the abbots over taxes. The Trencavels even tossed the Bishop of Albi in prison in 1178. The clergy and the nobles were fighting each other because a new force was disrupting the previous social order of noble, cleric, and serf. Thriving trade routes had resulted in thriving towns by 1200, and the bourgeoisie saw no need to defer to either noble or cleric. The largest urban centers were Toulouse, Montpellier, Beziers, Narbonne, Albi, and Carcasonne. In fact, it would be inaccurate to separate the religious freedom from the economic and political freedom. In 1167, the same year that the Cathars held their conference at Saint Felix, the merchants of Beziers had settled a disagreement with the Trencavel-Viscount by murdering him. The rising urban class also rebelled against the church's official ostracism of Jews, which forbade non-Christians from owning property or having authority over a Christian. The chief magistrate in Beziers was Jewish, while Narbonne had several synagogues. What we view today as religious tolerance, basic human decency, the papacy viewed as a critical threat to the church's iron control over the definition of humanity. Realizing that Count Raymond and the rest of the counts and viscounts could not be relied on to simply kill the heretics, Innocent resolved to combat the Cathars the hard way, sending clergy to debate the heretics in the halls and courtyards of local lords. The debates were truly democratic since both sides competed for followers among the listeners. Both sides shared a mutual contempt, and the monks who had worked so hard to eliminate women from their lives must have been appalled to find themselves debating female perfects. While Innocent was unintentionally legitimizing the Cathars, he was sending a stream of letters to King Philip of France promising him all of the Languedoc if he would lead an army to burn and slaughter the heretics. However, Philip ignored the letters. Actually, the Pope was probably not Philip's favorite person, since France had been placed under interdict by Innocent merely because he wanted to annul a marriage. Besides, he was busy first fighting King John of England and then solidifying his control over John's former lands during that time. The three papal legates were Abbot Amaury, head of the Cistercian order, and Peter of Cassel and Brother Raoul. Peter and Raoul debated Cathars at Carcasonne in 1204, but their emphasis on authority and submission did not win many converts. By 1206, the three legates were disillusioned and wanted to resign. However, Domingo de Guzman, future founder of the Dominican order, and Diego de Azevedo, Bishop of Osma, were sent by Innocent to help the exhausted legates. Domingo pointed out that the perfects were respected because they lived simple lives, unlike the legates who traveled with a huge entourage. Innocent himself had accepted the power of preachers living in poverty, co-opting Francis of Assisi, a gentle reformer, by permitting him to found his own order. Following Domingo's advice, the legates left their entourage and comforts behind and traveled as humble pilgrims throughout the Languedoc during the summer, engaging in fierce debates with Cathar perfects, including Blanche of Lalac. While they deserve credit for a genuine attempt, recruits remained few. So, in early 1207, the legates returned to their former lives, likely happy to have their comforts and flunkies again. Even his fellow legates thought Peter did more harm than good due to his quarrelsome attitude, so they replaced him with Bishop Fouque of Toulouse. However, it seemed that Innocent would have to admit that his legates had failed and returned to nagging Philip. Until Peter saved the day for the church. The nobles of Western Provence had revolted against Count Raymond. Both sides used mercenaries, which had been outlawed by the church, so Peter ordered them to stop and focus on persecuting heretics instead. Raymond bluntly refused, which resulted in immediate excommunication. Realizing that open defiance was satisfying but unprofitable, Raymond announced that he would stop hiring mercenaries and would drive heretics from his lands, so he was pardoned in August of 1207. However, Innocent had become tired of the stalemate and excommunicated Raymond again for a much longer list of reasons. Hoping to talk his way out of the situation, Raymond invited Peter to visit his castle, but the legate was too much for even the pleasure-loving count, and Peter finally stormed away on January 13th, 1208. The next morning, an unknown horseman appeared and killed Peter. Raymond claimed innocence, probably correctly, since it would be incredibly rash and out of character for a man who routinely avoided confrontation. Moreover, the legate had imprisoned many opponents and likely had many enemies, so the murder may have been unrelated. Rather than wait for the results of an investigation, Innocent promptly declared Peter of Cassonneau a saint and declared a crusade on March 10th. Promising a cancellation of temporal punishments for sins in exchange for a mere 40 days' service. Compared to a dangerous, expensive, months-long journey to Palestine, this was a bargain. Faced with a papal-backed crusade, Raymond swallowed his pride on June 18th, 1209, and agreed to be stripped to the waist and whipped in front of 20 churchmen for his unproven role in the murder of Peter of Cassonneau. Aside from the whipping, Raymond had to surrender 7 castles, apologize to all of the bishops, and dismiss all Jews from his service. 14 days later, Raymond took the cross, not out of any desire to combat heresy, but to preserve his lands from the horde of land-hungry crusaders about to rampage through the Languedoc, since the lands of a crusader could not be taken. Amaury and Bishop Fouque had traveled Europe preaching fire and destruction for the Languedoc, so numerous great lords led hundreds of knights and their thousands of retainers, accompanied by mercenaries and poor adventurers seeking profit of any kind. Many of them had fought in the Fourth Crusade that ended up serving the ambitions of Venice, attacking the Maritime Republic's Christian rivals, which resulted in an orgy of rape and looting following the capture of Constantinople. The main contemporary sources were written by 4 men who were involved in the crusade. A Cistercian monk whose abbot was the leader of the crusade, a cleric who served Raymond's stepbrother Baldwin, an anonymous writer who continued the cleric's work, and the chaplain of Count Raymond VII, who wrote from personal memory since he was a boy during the crusade. Even though they were clerics, they came from the same social class as the knights, and may even have been knights who had retired to a monastery or were rewarded with a bishopric. Viscount Raymond Roger Trencavel had rejected his uncle's offer of an alliance, believing that Toulouse would be the target of the crusade. Meeting with the leaders of the crusade, Raymond Roger pledged to help them. While Amaury had failed to win converts during his long tour of the region, he had learned who supported the Cathars, and Viscount Trencavel was one of them. Worse, the Viscount allowed a Jew to represent him in Beziers, so Raymond Rogers' application to become a crusader was rejected. Caught off guard, he advised the citizens of Beziers to prepare while he gathered an army and then left, taking the sizable Jewish community with him. The citizens of Beziers were determined to preserve the Cathars among them, and more important, their independence. Beziers was a well-supplied town of 10 to 14,000 people, so the citizens were confident that it could hold out long enough for the Crusader army to run out of food and break apart. Since the Crusaders only owed 40 days' service, this first defeat would probably end the crusade. The Bishop of Beziers was with the Crusaders and offered to spare the town if the 222 Cathar perfects on his list were handed over. The town leaders of Beziers were not the type of people to easily submit. They had murdered the Viscount's grandfather in 1156, and his son had retaliated with his own massacre during the feast of Mary Magdalene 2 years later, so the bourgeoisie and merchants understood the price of freedom and rejected the offer. The next day was the feast of Mary Magdalene, July 22nd. Mary Magdalene was more important than the other apostles to the local people, partially because the Gnostics, the predecessors to the Cathars, believed that she, not Peter, was first among the apostles. That day, the citizens of Beziers watched a sea of outsiders set up camp outside their walls. The experienced lords had inspected the impressive walls and then gathered to plan their siege. Meanwhile, some camp followers had commenced the time-honored ritual of exchanging insults with some young residents of the city. When one camp follower came too close, a group of bold, if not overly bright, youths opened a gate and rode out to administer a well-deserved beating. However, other camp followers saw an open gate and charged. The citizens guarding the gate delayed closing it, hoping to let the young bravos make it back inside safely. They delayed too long, enough camp followers made it in, the professional warriors saw what was happening and rushed to the assault. Traditionally, when a town was taken after a hard battle, soldiers were permitted to sack it. But even though Beziers had fallen with surprising ease, it was still sacked. In fact, according to a single, obscure source, the Crusaders asked Abbot Amaury what to do, since it was a Christian city, so it would be impossible to distinguish Catholics from Cathars. And he responded, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Abbot Amaury may not have actually said those words, but that phrase does symbolize the spirit of the crusade. Taken by surprise, the garrison was massacred. Actually, the citizens were slaughtered, and then the town was looted. It is unknown how many were killed in the sack of the city, undoubtedly thousands, but it was the ferocity that was shocking, since it was the start of the siege. Not even the Church of St. Mary Magdalene offered sanctuary. Crusaders broke down the doors and massacred the 1,000 or more people who were praying for safety. The scale of the massacre far exceeded anything that had occurred in Europe in the past century, even the accidental torching of a cathedral by Louis VII's mercenaries in 1143 that had caused the deaths of 1,000 people. There was no excuse for the bloodlust. The campaign had barely begun. One explanation for the rapid capture of Beziers is that the citizens had not expected an immediate assault, so the walls had not been properly manned. An explanation for the savage destruction is that it was performed by the less disciplined camp followers who had been fired up by preachers, and they were genuinely poor, so they seized the opportunity to loot. The unexpected victory meant that the crusade would not fade out after 40 frustrating days outside the walls of Beziers. There was even enough time to capture another castle before the end of the 40 days. Actually, the next 3 days were spent receiving homage from the local nobles whose lands were located between Beziers and Carcasonne, the next target. King Pedro of Aragon arrived at Carcasonne on August the 4th to register a formal complaint with Amaury for attacking the Trencavels, his vassals, without his permission. Pedro had been there 5 years earlier to preside over a debate between Cathars and Catholics, so the Viscount happily welcomed him, but Pedro advised him to negotiate, since Aragon was busy with the Reconquista, the war against the Muslims in Spain. The negotiations turned out to be a simple demand from Amaury that the Viscount and a few companions leave the city. When the abbot told King Pedro that the Viscount of Beziers would have to surrender all of Carcasonne, the king replied, "That will happen when donkeys fly in the sky." Unwilling to directly oppose the Crusaders, Pedro returned home, leaving Carcasonne to its fate. When an attack on August the 7th was beaten off, the Crusaders brought in their siege engines. However, thirst would be the main weapon since the water supply had been captured, so the lack of water spread disease throughout the city. After a week, an unnamed kinsman of the Viscount lured him to go alone into the Crusader camp for a meeting, and he was made prisoner. Once he had been captured, the residents were told that they could leave the city with only their clothes. The unrestrained looting at Beziers had destroyed most of the valuable loot, so the Crusade leaders kept a tighter leash on the soldiers. Imprisoned in his own dungeon, the Viscount died 3 months later, possibly due to ill treatment, intended to eliminate a dangerous figure without an execution that would make him a martyr. The surprising success of the Crusade presented the leaders with an unexpected problem, namely, what to do with the newly captured towns. The 40 days were over, and most of the Crusaders wanted to go home. So who would stay and rule Beziers and Carcasonne? Starting with the highest-ranked Crusaders, Papal Legate Amaury asked first the Duke of Burgundy, and then the Counts of Nevers and St. Paul, but they refused. Believing that they had earned sufficient indulgences, they were unwilling to risk their treasure and lives to possibly gain some lands in the turbulent south. Simon Montfort-Earl of Leicester did not have sufficient lands, so he accepted the offer. Appointed Viscount of Beziers and Carcasonne on August 15, 1209, Montfort found himself in command of a much smaller army, so the likelihood that he would hold on to his new lands seemed small. I will explain how Montfort surpassed expectations in the next episode. Thanks for listening.